Today, we're going to be bleeding the brakes on your classic Mini. Hey everybody, thanks for joining me today on Classic Mini DIY. Today, we're going to be talking about bleeding your Mini's brakes. It's a pretty easy job, usually only takes about 30-45 minutes, and you'll need 2 people to do this job. Now the tools that you'll need to complete this job are pretty small. You're going to need DOT 3 and 4 brake fluid. Now this brake fluid is actually used in your clutch master cylinder as well, and the steps for bleeding that are very similar to bleeding your brakes. But I'll kind of go into that a little bit more once I get down into the car and show you guys how this whole bleeding process works. But you'll need DOT 3 or 4 brake fluid. This is in the US. I'm actually not sure what you'll need in the UK or overseas in other countries. But you'll just want to look and figure out which brake fluid. You can go to your auto parts store if you're in a different country and just make sure that it says for ABS brakes, disc, drum brakes, and anything in between, and you should be good. Your auto parts store will have a little bit more knowledge on that and can recommend something that's appropriate for this application. The next thing you'll need is a long skinny funnel. Now, I have some wider funnels, but this one I find is the easiest to use. It lets you get down into the brake master cylinder and really pour the fluid without spilling it everywhere. Because this brake fluid is corrosive, it's not gonna like burn your hands off or anything, but it will eat away your paint if you let it sit. So just be really careful with this. You don't want to mess up your Mini's paint. That goes for items on the inside of your engine bay as well. So any undercoating, things like that, you're going to want to avoid spilling it because it can make a mess and take away that paint. Next thing I recommend are gloves. Now, you've probably seen I wear gloves in just about every one of my videos. I don't like getting my hands dirty. I like working on my car, but I don't like getting out and finishing up and having grime all over my hands if I can avoid it. So this is no different. I'd strongly recommend gloves when working with brake fluid. It can irritate your skin, and it's a little bit different than oil in that sense that it's a little bit more abrasive on your skin. So good pair of gloves, nitrile, latex, whatever works for you. Strongly recommend that. Now the next thing that I recommend having, there are lots of different ways to do this, but I find this to be the easiest way to get the brake fluid out of the system at the bleeding ends of your brakes and actually catch it and throw it away, dispose of it properly. Now I'm going to come a little bit closer to the camera so you can see this, but basically what I have here is a Fanta bottle. Obviously there's no Fanta left in here, although it does look a little orange. There must have been some left over there when I did this last time. But I have a Fanta bottle for my catch can, and then I have a tube right here, just clear silicone tube, and a little clamp on the end there. And now what that does is it actually allows me to clamp this onto the bleeding end, and then I put the other end of the tube right in here. And so when you're bleeding the brakes, the brake fluid flows through the line and then gets caught in this Fanta bottle. Obviously you can use any soda, it doesn't have to be Fanta. Now the last thing that I recommend having is a nice shop towel. This one's nice, doesn't tear very easy, and it's strong, picks up kind of all the crap that would spill out. On the bleeding ends of your brakes, you're most likely going to spill a little bit of brake fluid. It's okay, but just keep this around. You can clean it up real easy. Let's go ahead and get out there and start taking apart everything, show you how it works. Alright, so as you can see, we're at the front of the car, and in all of our cars, there are 2 master cylinders, and each master cylinder is connected to the clutch and the brake. Now, when you press the pedal down, what happens is you press that pedal and a little plunger comes up, creates pressure inside here, presses that fluid out through this line and out to all of your brake lines. And that's what creates the pushing pressure. And now if you have drum brakes, what happens is that pressure then pushes your shoes apart and into the drum itself and stops your car. If you got disc brakes, what happens is it pushes the pads in, and the disc is in the center here, pushes them in and clamps down on that disc and helps you stop. Now, the reason we need to bleed brakes is sometimes what happens is air gets in these lines, especially if you just installed new brakes, or if you have, some sort of leak that you've just fixed, something like that. Air can get into these lines, and then what happens is when you create that pressure, before the fluid that's closest to the brakes can actually get compressed and pushed into those calipers or those shoes, it has to compress the air first. So you'll end up with a situation where you're pressing that air. You might not get any sort of braking pressure at all, at which case you won't brake, or it'll reach a point where there's enough compression in that air and then it finally pushes that other fluid out a little bit. But what that kind of translates to is really, really poor braking, or non-existent braking. Now the same logic can be applied to your clutch, and the pressure here moves down and actuates the clutch. And the same principle that works on your brakes, it disengages and engages your clutch. So first thing that we need to do here is take the cap off of our master cylinder for the system that we're going to bleed. In this case it's the brakes, and that's going to be this middle one here. So as you can see, my car's a right-hand drive Mini, so my master cylinders are on the right side where my pedals are. If you have a left-hand drive Mini, they'll be in the same spot but just opposite. So on the complete opposite but exact same placement on the other side of the car. Nice thing about Minis is that nothing changes too crazy when you switch between left-hand drive and right-hand drive. It's just kind of flopped. So you can apply these same rules to your left-hand drive Mini pretty easily. But anyway, so we'll take the cap off right here. And as we take that cap off, you'll see it's this little plastic one. Now, you'll want to take a look at this, make sure that it's not damaged in any way. If it is, you'll want to replace that. You just don't want debris getting in there, otherwise your brakes aren't going to work as well if something's down in those lines that shouldn't be. Next thing is we're going to check the brake fluid in here and make sure it's filled enough. Now, you should be able to see a little bit of fluid there, and if you do, it's probably filled enough. However, if you don't see any fluid or it looks kind of low, just pour a little bit more fluid in there. There's no specific amount that you need, you just need enough to create pressure in this line and press up. The next thing that we're going to do, put our nice little funnel in here, and you can see what I mean. Having this long skinny funnel is really nice because it's weird angle getting down in there. Now I have enough brake fluid in there, so I don't need to add any more right now. However, as you're bleeding the brakes, you're going to have to add more fluid because, as you can imagine, when something bleeds, it loses fluid. So as we push the fluid out of the lines, we're going to need to replenish it up here at the top. So that's where you put your DOT brake fluid in, pour it right down in here, and just make sure that it doesn't spill over and damage anything inside your car here. So this is the point where the two-person job bit that I was talking about comes into play. Now, you're going to have one person inside the car and one person outside the car at the bleed lines, opening and closing those as I build up pressure here in the car. So I'm going to pump this brake 3 times, 1, 2, 3, and then press and hold. And now when you press and hold, what this is going to do is hold that pressure that you've built up, and once that pressure is built up, you're going to have the second person who's down at your brake lines release the bleed line, and that bleed line is going to then allow this residual pressure here to press out of that line, and in turn also press out the air that is in that line. And that is the basic principle of how to bleed your brakes. And so you're going to repeat that step on every one of your brake lines. Alright, so here we are at the front of the car, and as you can see, this is our front brake caliper, and this is our standard brake line that runs all the way back to the master cylinder. And then what we have connected here is our bleed line that's connected to our Fanta bottle. And now, that bleed line, I have a small clamp on to kind of hold it onto that line. I just don't like risking that popping off of that bleed line and then kind of dumping brake fluid everywhere. It's not required, but I do really like that metal clip. So you can find those metal clips and the brake bleeding kit at Advance Auto, AutoZone, really anywhere that has auto parts. They should have some form of brake bleeding kit. They probably have some that are like kind of do-it-yourself, only one-person job. I've not had much success with those. I always have a friend come over and help me out with this job. Alright, so the next step is to have your friend do those 3 pushes. So 1, 2, 3, and then hold. And you're going to want him to hold with a great deal of pressure. And at this point, that's when you crack this line open. And as you can see there, we got brake fluid pouring on out. All right, so you tighten that back, and then you have your friend do that one more time. All right, and as you can see there is no additional air coming out of that line, and this side is bled. Next step is to move to the back of the car and bleed the rear drums. Now before we get started, you're going to want to go check your master cylinder, make sure that that still has enough brake fluid in it to keep pressure. If it doesn't, you're going to need to add a little bit more, and then we can start bleeding this nipple back here. So we are going to repeat the same steps that we did up on the front of the car. You're going to pump 3 times and then hold, and then once your friend is holding, you're going to brake it just like that. Release the pressure and then tighten it back up. And we're going to do that one more time. And once they're holding, you're going to release that pressure one more time and then shut it. Now as you can see back here, I didn't have that line to catch the brake fluid, and the reason I didn't use one is because the bleed nipple back here was a little bit too small and my hose was a little too big to fit on this. And instead what I did is I took my shop towel and laid that down on the bottom and caught all the brake fluid as it comes out of the car. Now it's a little bit harder to see if there's air in this line without that tube. However, you can kind of see if there was air in it, what you would be seeing is kind of a bubble, and you might hear it sputter a little bit as that air came out. In this situation, it was all brake fluid that came out, so we are golden. Alright, so that pretty much covers the main items for this job. It's a pretty simple job, however it can have pretty major consequences if it's not done properly. So, after you've bled your brakes, go ahead and check all the lines, make sure that there's no leaks. If there are any leaks, you're going to want to seal those, fix the lines, and then re-bleed the brakes. Next thing you're going to want to check is go ahead and look at that master cylinder, make sure it's topped off, you have a good amount of brake fluid in there so that that can actually operate properly and provide pressure to those brakes. And then finally, please test the car before you drive it. This is not something that you're going to want to just do and then hit the road right away. Test the car in your driveway, see if it stops. If it doesn't stop, remember your emergency brake does still operate properly because that is running off of 2 cables that run to the back drum brakes. But what that also means is that there's only 30% of the braking power available to you. The rear brakes provide 30%, and then the front brakes provide the remaining 70% of that braking power, which is why you get such a huge impact when you upgrade from drums to discs on the front of your car. But, like I said, that emergency brake will work, but remember, at high speeds, it's not going to be as effective. It may not be effective at all. So if you're at all apprehensive about this job, if you have any questions, you are just nervous about the job that you did, maybe you don't feel like you did it right, please bring your car to a certified mechanic and have them take a look at it. These guys are going to know exactly what they're looking at. The brake systems on these cars are not something that's novel. It's a very basic system, and it operates in a very, very basic, similar way to modern cars and the way they operate now. So please, I urge you, if you have any worries, please bring it to a mechanic. I don't want you guys to crash your nice old Mini Coopers and damage anything or hurt yourself. Otherwise, that's it for Classic Mini DIY today. If you have any questions, like I said, please post them in the comment section below. Otherwise, enjoy those minis, subscribe, and motor on.